The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus was teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and a woman was there who for 18 years had been crippled by a spirit. She was bent over, completely incapable of standing erect. When Jesus saw her, he called to her and said, "Woman, you are set free of your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and she at once stood up straight and glorified God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant that Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, said to the crowd in reply, "There are 6 days when work should be done. Come on those days to be cured, not on the Sabbath day." The Lord said to him in reply, "Hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his ass from the manger and lead it out for watering? This daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 years now, ought she not to have been set free on the Sabbath day from this bondage?" When he said this, all his adversaries were humiliated, and the whole crowd rejoiced at all the splendid deeds done by him. The Gospel of the Lord. I think it'd be right for us to look at this gospel scene and just think it very strange, at least in part because we would follow Jesus in his logic here, and the ways of the synagogue leader here, the synagogue president, would not appear consistent to us because his ways are in fact not consistent. The challenge is to kind of situate this scene 2,000 years ago to see how it is, even the suggestion could arise that Jesus is not doing things in line with the ancestral law. So the challenge, the part of the problem is that what's at the center of this whole scene is the Sabbath, and Jesus' understanding of the Sabbath. But here we see that it's not too far from the way that the people themselves would have been practicing the Sabbath. Right? Jesus is saying, to them that they do these things, untying the ox, untying the ass from the manger and leading it out for watering. He's pointing out the fact that they do this, and if they do this, then how could it be that Jesus would not be able to untie this woman? Part of the challenge is that the people of Jesus' day have taken the law and the interpretation of it down to the details, and have kind of carved out exemptions for themselves where they were necessary. And so these are things that they had to do, and so of course God would allow them to do these things, take their animals out for watering, for feeding. But there were no exceptions or exemptions as they relate to healing. Why? Because it's not that common, right? It's like you can't do healing miracles on the Sabbath. Like we don't have exceptions for those kinds of works. Okay, I wouldn't expect you to, right? Who is doing these kinds of works, and why would the exceptions be necessary? The challenge there is when you have that, the juxtaposition of what they're allowed to do with what they're not allowed to do. You start to get some sense of the way that they're using the law, and their lack of understanding of the Sabbath. One of the things I remember speaking to a conservative Jewish rabbi. I'm not sure that I get the order of those words right, but he's a conservative Jew. He's a rabbi. He impressed on me the fact that on the Sabbath they have to drink a glass of wine. Right? So we tend to think, maybe because our own encounter with Sabbath regulations is that elevator in the hotel that stops at every floor, right? There's this kind of strict prohibition against almost like touching anything, right? Yeah, pressing a button. You can't press a button. But that's also, that's fine in terms of interpretation of the law and the Sabbath. But do we miss the idea that this is actually the day of celebration? It's a day when God, having created all things in those 6 days, then consecrates creation by himself entering it and enjoying it with his image bearers. Right? So and that's part of the understanding. And then we can understand, if we take that view, we can understand then Jesus's logic as it relates to the observance of the Sabbath. In fact, he said this is an easier case than the ones that you've already tried, right? So of course you allow yourselves to take the animals out, but here we have to also unbind the woman. But can we say then that's a lot of prefatory remark for what will hopefully be a brief exhortation, is just this sense of how easy it is to get this all wrong. Yeah. And even, I don't know how we see in this scene the discomfort with Jesus at work. So the discomfort with God, who wants to perform this great work of healing. And part of it is like the not knowing how to categorize what God is doing, which means then that we, like they, but we can't control it. So very uncomfortable. So but what I'd say is, although God is working here according to his own plan, and quite clearly even his own Sabbath plan, it's easy enough to misunderstand that, and it's doubly easy to misunderstand it when we have an agenda that competes with it. So they have their own understanding of how this is all to work, and it was not the way that God intended it to be. It was not the way that Jesus himself was then pushing forward and proclaiming. There's a lot in here about kind of the seclusion and purification of a people. If we can just get everybody to obey the law to its minutest detail, then we will God's kingdom will come. Right? Then God will return and rule. And yet God is a bit more wild than that. He's a bit more untamed. He's not domesticated. He's going to do the works that he intends to accomplish, and he's going to do them when and where he wills. And when he does them, the response of the crowd ought to be the response that God received. They rejoiced at all the splendid deeds done by him. Now, when and where God is at work, the response ought to be, by us and by all, the rejoicing at all the splendid deeds he does. Today, right, in our own lives, we have to be recipients of the healing work of Jesus. So where does he want to untie us for God's purposes? Right? Where does he want to liberate us? And are we preventing him in any way? Where does he want to go deep? What part of our heart does he want to touch? And I say, here again in the Gospel of Luke, we're looking at the difference between death and life. Where does Jesus want to give us life? What part of our heart is not open to his will and his way? Where are we not comfortable with Jesus coming in and curing? Right? Where would we prefer to have hearts hardened to God? Where are our hearts not, say, joyful praise of God and outpouring of self in love, in joy-filled generosity for God? Where are our hearts not alive? That's the first part. We have to be recipients of God's, of his healing love. No constraints or restraints at all. Eager for that work that Jesus wants to do. And then where is he calling us to serve him with that same heart that we've given to him in praise? Where does he want us to be an outpouring of self and an agent of his healing and restorative love and mercy and grace for the world? We ought to act as though there are no limits. Yeah, we've been freed, right? We've been loved into new life, and now we're to be we're meant to be manifestations of that same generous love to everyone we encounter.